Hi, excuse me, welcome. If you are regular, or if you've come to at least a few of our concerts, you know what's about to happen. If you're new, welcome. I'm Eric Hansen, I'm the conductor of the orchestra, and before each of the programs, I spin a few webs of truths about the composers and about the pieces that we're doing. And just to give you a little bit of insight in addition to our spectacular program notes that we have. So welcome. I'll probably repeat some of this when I come out at the beginning of the concert in 20 minutes or so, but thank you very much for coming. I know it's been a very challenging time the last 3 years, and the orchestra's been playing for the last 2 years, so this is our third year during this mess that we're calling life. So thank you very much, and I hope for at least a few hours you can enjoy yourselves and maybe not forget issues that are going on outside the doors of this wonderful church so much as enjoy the music. The 3 pieces on the program, we typically do 3 pieces, sometimes 2, and every once in a while one very long, large piece like a Mahler symphony. But we have I would say, more of a typical program this afternoon, in that we're doing an introductory work, an overture, which is actually an overture to an opera. And then we're doing a suite from a ballet. And then the second half of our program is a very unique piece by Robert Schumann that's, I hesitate to use this, but I will. It's 3/4 of a symphony. And I'll explain that later. You can guess what that means. So 2 of our composers, the first and third pieces, Hector Berlioz and Robert Schumann, are composers who are firmly positioned in the middle part of the 19th century. They're both very, very fine, very important, if you like classical music, romantic era composers. And although their music is very, very different, their personalities were very different, their backgrounds were substantively different, nevertheless, their music has all of the features you expect from romantic music: a full-size orchestra, a very dramatic, sometimes program music. In other words, when you listen to the music, even if it's a symphony that does not have a program per se, a plot, nevertheless, you'll find your mind going to a place where, like in a movie, there would be a sword fight, or 2 people making love, or people discussing, or a sunset, or the sun coming up in the morning. And so the romantic style tends to evoke very dramatic, almost kind of tableaus, if you will. And of course, this is because of all of the elements of the music having to do with melodies and tempo changes, and the use, a more advanced use, and even of Beethoven, of instrumentation and what's called voicing, in that you assign specific melodies to certain instruments. So a melody played by a clarinet is going to be necessarily unique in what you would expect that would bring out those qualities of the clarinet versus the violin or the viola or trombone, let's say. And then our third composer, the second piece on the program, is Cécile Chaminade, a very important composer to us who enjoy classical music for a number of reasons. She's perhaps less well known than Berlioz or Schumann, simply because the balance of her her compositions are solo pieces for piano or piano duet. But she did write compose several works for orchestra, and in fact a concerto, a Concertstück that she wrote for herself. Part of her fame, if you will, is that she was one of the greatest pianists alive. And she lived a very long life of some 80 plus years, dying just towards the end of the World War II. And many of her compositions were created in the 1880s and 90s. I mentioned she was a very fine pianist, and so this kind of explains why a lot of her music is for piano. And she did not compose a lot of chamber music. She did compose songs, some very delightful, beautiful songs. But her piano music is revered by pianists and, of course, by audiences throughout the world. She was, just a kind of a sidebar note, as you would imagine, the Legion of Honor, sorry for my French, an award given for meritorious purposes by the French government, starting with Napoleon in very early 1800s, and then to this day, has been awarded to some 3,000 people, and many of them French, but also foreigners as well, for a wide variety of reasons. It's not just specific, like the Nobel Prizes or having categories. It's given to people who give something to society, either through being a writer, an artist, somebody who helps, an architect, but also military personnel as well. And Cécile Chaminade was one of the first women to receive this award, and it was pretty rare at that time when she received it early in the 20th century. The piece we're doing by her is from a ballet that I mentioned, and unfortunately it's unpublished, so it's not going to be performed anywhere, although I suspect there's some enterprising graduate student or composer who's going to perhaps gather up all the separate movements and hopefully have a performance, because the music is very delightful, as you'll discover when we play it later on. The Berlioz is an overture. Now Berlioz, many of you know, have been coming for several years. He happens to be a favorite of mine, and we don't play his music every year, but quite often, and we've certainly done his Symphonie Fantastique during my tenure with the orchestra several times, as well as most, if not all, of his overtures. Overtures are sometimes standalone pieces, meaning they're meant to be performed by themselves in a concert setting such as this. But of course, also the very first music that you hear if you go to the opera or to the ballet is frequently titled as an overture. And the music is played, of course, before the curtain comes up and either the dancing begins, or as I say in opera, people start to be killed. Sorry. But in this instance, what we have is we have an overture that's very typical. Almost everything by Berlioz is recognizable, partly because he uses a huge orchestra. We have a full complement of woodwinds, we have horns, we have trombones, we have trumpets, we have percussion. There are going to be at one point, actually a number of points, 3 people playing 3 different timpani at the same time. Your ears won't necessarily get pinned back, but at the same time, please understand he is someone who understood very early in the Romantic era, and we're talking 1830s on, that he could use resources of a very large orchestra with a very diverse instrumentation, different instruments in all the sections, but also either contract or expand the orchestra. Not just have it play very quietly at times with everyone, or very loud at times with everyone, but in fact sometimes you'll only hear 1 or 2 people playing at a time. And so he was quite adept at doing this. He was very progressive in developing this ability to have a very small group expand suddenly or gradually. It's like if you know about the swell box on an organ, where there's a box with pipes inside, and while they're being played, it's kind of like shutters that are closed, and the organist can pull the stop and open up, so it makes kind of a swell sound, if you will, like a crescendo getting louder. Berlioz is a master of this, but also the master of matching up instruments that you would not think are going to match, and assigning melodies to instruments you would not expect in 1830. Of course, Beethoven, if you want, at the end of his life, he's basically on the cusp, the beginning of Romantic music with this spectacular Ninth Symphony, and you all know that the Ode to Joy melody that you hear, that's the most dramatic part, at least culturally and aesthetically for mankind. In the last movement, the Ode to Joy melody is first played, in fact, by the cellos and the string basses, which is rather unique for Beethoven's time, and certainly extremely rare for Mozart and Haydn to give a really critically important melody to something other than a violin or one of the woodwinds, let's say, or a horn perhaps. Berlioz, on the other hand, after an initial kind of an outburst from the orchestra, which is in fact the very energetic melody that, if you will, describes or rather inhabits the character of the lead, the name of this opera, Benvenuto Cellini. After these first 15 or 20 seconds, you're going to hear kind of a very static melody played very slowly, pizzicato, plucked string, and then cello and bass. This is the Pope thing. Bum, 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 bum. And it just goes like this. And then you have later on, you're going to hear a kind of a filigree melody. You're going to have multiple melodies in the first several minutes of this 10 or 12-minute work. And then Berlioz does something which is really extremely difficult, and very few composers throughout history have mastered this. This is the art of counterpoint, where you just don't have, like in a pop tune, somebody singing the melody while the band accompanies the person in the background, or like a sax player's a solo, improvised solo in jazz group, and the rhythm section, if will, can be dramatic but in the background. Counterpoint is the art of having 2 or 3 or 4 melodies all at once. And it's incredibly intricate, like a jigsaw puzzle that has all sorts of subjects that kind of blend into each other. And Berlioz does this. He's such a master of all the arts, if you will, of composition early on in the 19th century that he did this fairly early in his career. A spectacular piece. The Schumann I mentioned is 3/4 of a symphony. And the title you'll notice when we get to the piece, which is second half of the program, is Overture, Scherzo, and Finale. So you're kind of not being misled, but I say this not to say, oops, he forgot the second movement, which is a slow movement like a romance or something, or adagio, slow. But in fact, the piece was created by him with intent to be this very different 3 movements, and yet at the same time they form a cohesive whole. Schumann is much more, if you will, the introvert than the extrovert Berlioz. And though his music is very, very dynamic, its intricacy really comes to the forefront. He's a master of leading you down a path and harmonically, and all of a sudden having a chord that kind of punches you in the face. Not like, contemporary music or even Stravinsky, now 100 years old with The Rite of Spring, but still chords that are just have filled with dissonance, and they come almost out of nowhere. So the music at the beginning is going to sound very much like, if you will, a dramatic work by Mozart or by Haydn, and all of a sudden there is going to be this kind of glaringness to the music, and it'll stop for a moment and then reset. Schumann's more of a miniaturist, where he pieces together little pieces, little melodies that fit together more like a necklace of pearls that are nevertheless very different, natural pearls, and you tend to want to look at each of them individually as well as the whole. So he's a master of creating these scenarios. We were having a discussion the other day in orchestra, and I said something like, or maybe a member of the orchestra said, both Berlioz and Schumann were crazy, and that's probably true. Nevertheless, Schumann actually ended his life in an asylum. And probably, like many people, probably died of all sorts of effects of syphilis or something along these lines. So he had a lot of issues at the end of his life, but nevertheless was composing until the end. And the dissonance in his music is not because he was nuts, per se. It's because this is his style of composition to kind of lead you down a path and then surprise you with something, not by hitting you over the head like Berlioz might be prone to doing, but doing it in a much more subtle way. So I hope you enjoy these 3 pieces. I'll come out again and talk very, very briefly about each when we start the program, but I hope you really enjoy this, and thank you again for coming.